a guest on the show to defend the Lawsuit Reform Alliance's involvement with a report on New York Scaffold Law. Tom Stebbins said the organization did not influence the report to make it more anti-scaffold, but not everyone agrees. And so we are fair here on Capitol Tonight. We are giving the other side a chance to explain their side of the story. With us, we have Josie Duffy. She is the staff attorney for the Center for Popular Democracy. Josie, welcome to Capitol Tonight.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. Okay, so I know that you guys are familiar with Tom Stebbins' argument. This report has gotten a lot of criticism. The Rockefeller Institute has distanced itself from the report. What is it exactly that you believe is the problem?
Well, just to start out and give a short explanation of what we're talking about here, we're talking about a safety law that protects workers. We're talking about a law that basically says as long as employers follow the law, as long as they don't break the law, they won't be held responsible for their employees' injuries. But if they fail to make workplaces safe, they will be held responsible if one of their workers is injured on site. So this report that was released has a couple of problems. I mean, the first is that there's impropriety from the beginning, right? This group, Lawsuit Reform Alliance,
yeah.
Basically is an anti-worker lobbyist group that set up a front group to pay SUNY for this report. They paid $83,000 for this report.
Yep.
And once they sort of saw what the findings were, they became pretty intricately involved in sort of putting their own opinion in and changing the findings. So the process is actually a serious problem,
okay.
Right? Mr. Stebbins himself. I'm sorry?
Well, let me just interrupt you, forgive me, to ask just a couple of questions before we get any further. First of all, we should state, and it's been stated, both sides have been stated on the show, that not everyone believes that this is, well, pro-worker, yes, but I think that the other side says, well, it's anti-business, and if you reformed it or changed it, there would be more jobs, which would also be pro-worker. That's what the argument is on the other side, right? And you guys have been fighting over this. Not you personally necessarily, but the two sides have been fighting for years, correct? For years. Yes, I mean the conversation about the Scaffold Law is coming sort of to a point right now, but the Scaffold Law is about 100 years old, so it's been happening for some time. Right. So regarding the report, I mean, two things. First of all, this issue about who paid for it and whether they were a front group, et cetera. I mean, you would agree, right, that this happens all the time. It's not, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it is not unusual for an organization to pay for a report, to commission a report, and for them to hope and then perhaps try and manipulate, to be serious and frank. I mean, it happens all the time. The outcome of that study, they want a study to back up their side. The other side, you guys issue reports too.
No, I agree that obviously research gets funded all the time by different groups and different groups that have different goals.
Yep.
You know, I think the problem that is so egregious here is the actual influence, detailed annotations of what the original report said. And that included literally changing numbers. It included eliminating a part of the study where they talked to engineers on a work site who all the parties on the work site said that the costs of this law were negligible, and one guy was an engineer who had been working for 20 years in the same industry and didn't even understand what the Scaffold Law was, didn't even know that it was a thing. You know, this idea that they influenced it, I mean, this is real influence, right? This is changing the bottom line.
Okay, so what now, obviously, and people may or may not have caught Mr. Stebbins' interview, and if they didn't and they're interested, I encourage them to see that so they can then determine for themselves what they believe is the situation going on here. But the problem, as it seems to me, is that this report is now sucking up all the oxygen in the room. No longer are we debating the merits or lack thereof of the Scaffold Law. Instead, we're debating this report and whether or not it was influenced and how appropriate it is, et cetera. And that sort of just spins us away from the problem at hand, doesn't it?
I would say that it's important to focus on both. I think that when we're talking about a group of people that is really advocating against worker safety, it's important to know the influence they've had over the numbers they're releasing. To say that something is fact and then have it clearly indicate that
it's been manipulated is a huge problem and I think a little disturbing, especially for members of the coalition who are in support of the Scaffold Law. But I agree with you. I think that the Scaffold Law itself and the workers who are affected by it needs to be the main focus of this conversation, and that's what we're trying to do.
And I think I understood, and the last time we left this conversation when we were just focusing on policy and not on the report and its merits, both sides said that they thought that there might be somewhere, someday, some happy medium where everyone could come to the table and agree. Now, the governor himself sort of poured cold water on that at the end of the last legislative session when he said, this isn't happening, and it seems to be heating up somewhat. But do you think that there's somewhere that you can agree, the report aside?
I absolutely hope so. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that workers continue to be protected. So our ultimate goal is to make sure that employers follow the law, that work sites are safe for workers, and that when workers are injured or killed on the job, the employer is held responsible if the employer is at fault. To me, that seems pretty uncontroversial. What we're basically saying is, as long as you follow the minimal safety regulations that the law requires, you can't be held liable. Well, so I would hope that we could all agree on that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems the other side says that this is a question of absolute liability, right? And that they're incapable of affording the insurance, which is higher, the costs are higher because of this law in New York State. That aside, I know that you guys disagree on that, but even if the Scaffold Law did not exist, workers would still be protected, would they not? No one would be able to prevent someone from suing.
So nobody can, at this point with the law that exists right now, and I think this is a misconception that is really important to clear up. Absolute liability doesn't mean at all that employers are automatically held liable. They get their day in court. They get their opportunity to show exactly what happened. That's not what absolute liability means. That's actually strict liability, which is a different standard. So this idea that the minute someone gets injured, the employer is automatically held responsible, they're bankrupted. I mean, it's absurd, right? Like this is how the system works. Once someone breaks the law, they are subject to their day in court. And if they can prove that they didn't break the law, we won't hold them responsible. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that this insurance question, which keeps coming up. You know, the fact is that the other side doesn't know what the insurance costs actually are, and neither do we, and that's because there's no transparency with these insurance companies, and we don't know what they're charging for premiums, and we don't know why. We don't know what goes into the calculation.
Well, we know what they're charging, yeah.
Right? We know what they're charging, right? Exactly. So, you know, part of the problem here is that we are talking about insurance premiums. Insurance premiums are going up everywhere, regardless of, including states that don't have a scaffold law, right? So insurance premiums are rising left and right. And the other side, actually, the Lawsuit Reform Alliance, is not supporting the state, the introduction of a state bill, which, as you know, was introduced by Assemblyman Moya. They're not actually supporting that bill. So they're saying that, you know, these premiums are going up, but they're not actually trying to find out what these premiums are calculated
and then, okay.
Or how they're calculated.
And we're almost out of time, but I just want to reiterate this question. If the Scaffold Law didn't exist, never written, tomorrow disappeared, it would not stop people from suing. There would still be worker protections. Is that correct?
Well, this is actually the problem, right? If the Scaffold Law didn't exist, part of the problem would be that the burden would now be on taxpayers. So workers' comp, Medicaid, these costs that would go into, you know, paying for the work for whatever injuries happened would be paid out of a different system, because that's how, as you know, workers' comp work. So the taxpayers would be paying for it, not the employer. And you know, I think that's really the main point. At this point right now, what it's saying is that employers only have to follow the law, and if they think that they follow the law, if they think it's not their fault that an employee was injured, they are free to go to court and free to try to prove their point. I mean, we're we're not interested in automatic liability. We're interested in making sure that if workers, if an employer breaks the law and an employee shows that the law has been broken, the employer is held responsible.
Well, to be continued, because it's hardly the end of this conversation. Yeah. I know we will talk about
it.
It
is not the end.
in the legislative session to come.
Absolutely.
Josie Duffy, thank you so much for your time.
Yes. Thank you so much, Liz.